Hmm. All right, 1 o'clock. 1 o'clock Thursday afternoon, March 2nd, and it's time for some composition study. So if you're here for composition, you're in the right place. If you're not here for composition, you've got some problems today and need to find where you belong. So give me a wave if you can hear me okay. Everybody hears me okay? Good. All right. So today we're going to move into real composition studies. Last week, we just sort of had an introduction. We talked about composition, about writing and things like that, and how you can improve your writing generally. And if you remember, what I said is the way to get better as a writer, just like just about anything else, is to actually take responsibility for your writing and take it seriously. Every time you write something, see it as an opportunity to get better at writing. And the same thing is true with speaking. With speaking, often you can just answer lazily and carelessly, but if you just think about every opportunity that you have to speak or write, if you take it seriously and make the most of it, you can use every opportunity to improve your speaking. Another thing with speaking that's worth thinking about before we get started is because we have the means of recording ourselves both by video and audio. It's good sometimes just to record yourself doing things just so that you can see what you look like on video, what other people actually see when you talk, and listen to what you sound like, because often we think that we look and sound differently than we actually do. And it's a good experience for us to realize that maybe other people don't think that you're as handsome as you imagine that you are when you talk to people, or maybe you have bad habits in your speaking that you would never realize unless you watched yourself on a video. Because when you watch yourself, you can compare yourself to other people you see talking on videos, and it's very helpful. And you can spot problems, you can spot things that you just don't like personally about the way you say things, or certain words you use, or habits you have. And you can work on fixing them and concentrate on them little by little. But if you want to get better at speaking and writing, you just have to practice and take responsibility for them, and concentrate on getting better. So that's a personal issue. That's a personal commitment issue. And we've got students. Normally there's two different kinds of students. There's one student who is just trying to get the bare minimum done for everything. He's always doing as little as he can. He submits assignments and hopes that the teacher will give him credit for them. He does them as poorly as possible, as quickly and carelessly as possible, and hopes for the best. And if he gets like a 75 on an assignment, he's content with that, because he doesn't care about quality, or he just wants to get the lesson checked off so he can move on. That person in the end is going to have real problems, because you can get through school, and school is all fake. School is artificial. You can cheat in school. You can cut corners in school. You can get grades in school. But when school is over and you get plopped out into the street as an adult, and you've got to suddenly compete for, to earn a living, or to get admitted into an institution or a program that you want to participate in, all of a sudden, all of that cheating and corner cutting and minimum, work that you've done, that all suddenly catches up with you, and you're trapped, unprepared for the contest that you face in life. So that's the danger of that life, of cheating and things like that. The reason why, I don't really yell at students about cheating. I don't pay attention to cheating. I don't even care about cheating, because I simply warn students, if you cheat, if you don't follow instructions, if you don't take the lessons seriously, you don't need a teacher to yell at you. You don't need parents to yell at you. You're just going to get yourself into a situation in life where you're going to learn a very hard lesson, and you asked for it. So I prefer just to warn students not to go down that path, not to think that they're getting away with something, but to take their studies seriously, to take personal responsibility for their studies, because ultimately it's going to be you as an adult, more or less by yourself. I mean, obviously we'll still be connected with our families and have the support of our friends and families, but there's just a lot of life that you have to deal with by yourself. And, your studies are your own personal preparation for that adult life that you're going to live by yourself. So don't be that kid who cuts corners and does the minimum, because you're going to pay for it and you're going to regret it. The other kind of student is the student who, takes pride in a good sense. I don't mean like an arrogant, foolish pride. I mean a good pride, a self-respecting pride in their work, and they want to get better. They see schooling as an opportunity to get help, to get better. I mean, think about it. If you submit an assignment to me, I'm willing to help you get better. I'm willing to review your work. I'm willing to offer corrections. I'm willing to tell you when things are wrong. If you have questions, I'm willing to answer those questions. You've got parents willing to help you at this point in your life. You've got teachers willing to help you at this point in your life. And if you take advantage of those opportunities, you can really help yourself as you move into adulthood, but only if you take advantage of those opportunities. And most kids don't. That's part of the problem with schooling. Most kids don't take advantage of them. And that's especially true with reading and writing and speaking and arguing. You're never going to have the opportunities to learn these things that you have now while you're in your school years, because once you're an adult, someone's going to expect you to start providing for yourself, especially if you're a boy. You're going to have to start providing for yourself when you reach adulthood, and the need to work and generate an income is going to take away from your opportunity to devote yourself to studies. So when you're a kid and your mom and dad are happy to pay all your bills, they're actually legally required to pay all your bills, you have this window of opportunity to take advantage of, to get as much study done as possible, to use as much of the resources and help that you have available to you. And, very few students take advantage of those opportunities. So I want to encourage you to do that. So as we get into composition studies, realize what a rare opportunity it is to be able to spend so much time focusing on developing your own writing skills, improving your writing, having a bunch of people who are willing to read your writing, be able to post them on forums, share them with classmates and stuff like that. It's a unique opportunity that you have in life, and you have to try to make the most of it. All right. So that's my little moral introduction. And I'll leave it to you to decide what you're going to do. But last week, that's what I talked about. I talked about getting better in writing by simply taking responsibility for your own writing. That's how it gets done. Today, what I'd like to do is get into the actual work of writing, and I'd like to talk about the goals of composition. What are the actual goals? No matter what it is, whether it's a text message, whether it's a forum post, whether it's an email, whether it's a formal essay, whether it's a speech that we have to give somewhere, whether it's a class that we have to teach, anytime we have to communicate, there's a goal to that communication. We're trying to accomplish something in our communication. Sometimes those goals might be silly. Sometimes those goals might be very important. And so we've got to learn to think about the goals whenever we communicate and how we can pursue those goals in the best way possible. And one thing that's very important to understand is that achieving your goals in speaking or writing is not in your control. Achieving your goals is not in your control. And you've got to always remember that. So for example, if let's say one of you is about to make a terrible decision in life, and I decided to write you a letter or have a meeting with you or call you on the phone and talk to you to try to persuade you not to go down a certain path. Well, two different things are going to happen. First of all, I'm going to have the opportunity to say what I would like to say to you. That's the first thing. But then secondly, you're going to have the freedom to make your own decisions, and I can't control that. So I have the opportunity to present a persuasive message to you, and then you have freedom to make your own decisions. I cannot control the decisions that you ultimately make. So my goal in communicating is not actually to control your decision and make you do a certain thing. That's not the goal of my letter or my email or my conversation with you. The goal of my conversation with you again, is not to make you do something, because that's impossible. Unless I was there to like physically tie you up and lock you in a cage so you couldn't make a bad decision. In communication, that's not an option. We have freedom and we can't force people to do things. So we have to learn as speakers and writers that our goal is not to produce some outcome that's not in our control. And this is what most people get wrong when they speak or when they write or when they make a video or something else. The goal that they have is a foolish goal that's not realistic. So if you're asked to talk to a crowd of people, to stand in front of a room and give a speech or a lesson, we often get nervous about that. And the reason why we get nervous is because our goal for that activity is to accomplish something that's not in our control. And so we're nervous because we don't know how the crowd is going to respond. And so we're nervous about that. And that's our own fault because we don't understand what the goal should really be. When we understand what the goal should be, we understand that there are specific things that we need to accomplish as the speaker or as the writer, and these things are completely in our control. And so if I stand on a stage in front of a crowd of people, and I know that my goal is not to control their life or force them to make a certain decision, because that's impossible. My goal is to simply present my argument in the clearest and strongest way possible. And as long as I know that I've done that, I can walk off the stage satisfied and know that my speech or my whatever was effective and I succeeded in my goal. It's like going to confession. When you go to confession, your goal in confession is just to give the best possible confession that you can. Sometimes you may forget something, sometimes you may neglect, but the goal is to make the best confession possible. And that's in your control. And the same thing is true with writing and speaking. So what I want to do today is just help you to understand that when you speak to people, when you write to people and so on, the goal is not to control the outcome of what they decide to do after you speak or write to them. The goal is to simply communicate what you wanted to communicate or what you're responsible to communicate, and to communicate it in the most effective way possible that's within your power. And then to judge yourself based on whether or not you've done that. And the reason why that's important is because when you walk away, so let's imagine this situation where I give you advice and you're about to make a decision and I think you might make a bad decision. So I want to really make my argument to you and give you the reasons why you should not choose option A. And I want to give you the reasons why you should choose option B. And then I have to leave you to make that decision, right? Well, I may find out 2 weeks later that you made the bad decision. And now I'm going to feel bad. I'm going to be upset. I'm going to be frustrated. But here's the important thing. I'm going to know whether I communicated what I wanted to communicate as effectively as I could and did all that I could. And if I have done so, and I know that I did so, then I won't have a guilty conscience or feel like maybe it was my fault. And that's the goal of communication, is to acquit ourselves, to free ourselves from any guilt in the errors and faults of other people that we communicate with. It's for the sake of our own conscience to know that, you know what? James was about to make a decision and I didn't want him to make a bad decision. And I made it very clear to him. I gave him all the reasons. I know that I did the best that I could possibly do to communicate to him the reason why he should choose B instead of A. And he chose A anyway. And I know that, and I can walk away from that. Even though I'm upset about the decision, I can walk away knowing that I have a good conscience. I have a clear conscience because I said what needed to be said and I accomplished the goal of my communication. Okay, so it's important for us to understand the goal and not have a wrong idea of the goal. Because if we have a wrong idea of the goal, then we'll get into all kinds of stupidness and make all kinds of errors and get into all kinds of fights and ruin relationships and all kinds of other stuff because we're trying to do the wrong thing. And you know what that feels like, because you probably know people who try to do that to you, who try to, not just give you counsel, but try to actually control decisions that you have to make for yourselves, and decisions that you are going to make for yourselves, no matter what. So it's important for us to understand what our goal is, to be able to set good goals when we write, and then to be able to walk away knowing that we accomplished that goal. I wrote the article that I wanted to write. I gave the speech that I wanted to give. I wrote the email that I wanted to give. I wrote the forum post that I wanted to post. Okay, we can walk away accomplishing our goals and being careful not to set the wrong goals, because that leads to all kinds of goofiness. And you've seen bad examples of this. And I'll give you an example, okay? Here's an example. You may go to a church where the people in the church are very, very concerned about having young people make good religious decisions. And so what do? They think, well, what can we do to make the kids like church? And so what they always do is try to act cool or try to act young and try to do all kinds of goofy things to entertain the kids and be relevant, or be stylish or whatever. And normally what happens is they make fools of themselves, right? And it actually has the opposite effect. It has the opposite effect. The kids sit there saying, man, this is so cringy. This is so weird. This is so awkward. And the reason why is because they're trying to accomplish a goal that isn't their responsibility. And that's what creates these kinds of situations. And like I said, it often has the opposite effect, right? If you're in Aesop's fables, think about the fable of the wind and the sun, right? The wind and the sun. The wind tries to force the person to take off his coat. And what does the person do in response? The person clings to his coat and holds onto it even more strongly because he feels the wind trying to blow it off. That's how most people react when you try to force them to do something. Their initial reaction is just to resist and cling more tightly to what you're trying to blow off them. And the fable of the wind and the sun taught us that the sun can get the person to take off the coat by simply presenting the reason to take off the coat, which is that it's warm, and the person freely and voluntarily takes off his coat. He doesn't need to have his coat ripped off him. And so think about that fable when we get into composition, right? You're not to try to be the wind and blow the coat off people, because that's not going to work. You need to think about being like the sun and presenting people with the reasons why they should take their coat off. That's how it actually works, okay? And like I said, as kids growing up, you're going to experience all kinds of things where people try to lead you to make decisions by acting like the wind rather than like the sun. And you know what happens when that happens. It doesn't work, because God created us to be free. We make decisions based on our own will, on our own understanding, and so on. And we're going to make those decisions no matter what. So when we communicate to people, we have to respect their freedom and communicate them to persuade by giving them reasons, not by trying to force them to do something by emotional games and stuff like that. So let's talk about goals. On the board behind me, I've got a couple of things written. Let me stop sharing my screen for a second here. Actually, I'm not sharing my screen. That's good. Okay, never mind. So on the board behind me, you should be able to see a list of things, and it says the goal of composition, the goal of composition, and there's a bunch of different things. So in this goal of composition, we've got a number of different people and things that we're accountable to that we have to think about. So if I have the opportunity to write something or speak something, the first thing that I have to think about is whether or not what I say or write is is pleasing to God. That's the ultimate goal in what I say and write, is that whether what I say and write is pleasing to God. That's my first concern, because that's my first responsibility. All right. What I write and say has to be pleasing to God. So anytime that there's a question for me to answer or a problem for me to get into with someone, I have to ask the question. I have to stop myself from just babbling my own opinions. And I have to ask myself, what is the actual truth in this situation? What is God's will in this situation? What would God actually want me to do in this situation as a speaker or as a writer? What would God want me to communicate? And that takes study. So you can see when St. James in the Bible says, be slow to speak. We're told that we should be slow to speak because we don't have the freedom to just go into the world and push our own opinion. Our responsibility in the world is to promote God's will through our speaking and writing and behavior. So the first thing we've got to do is not speak, not write, and first think and study and learn what the truth actually is. And we have a responsibility to the truth first. We have to figure out what actually needs to be said. We don't necessarily know that. Just because, we think we're really smart doesn't mean we're actually smart. We have to study and research things, look up answers, and make sure we know what needs to be said, because we're accountable to God for what we say and write. That's the first thing. Secondly, on the board, it says politics. It says politics because we also have a responsibility to our community. We're not just these selfish monsters that live in the world by ourselves. Everything we do has an effect on other people. If you choose to not work in your life, that choice is going to affect other people. If you choose to be lazy, if you choose to be deceitful or selfish, whatever, your behavior is also going to affect other people. So we've always got to stop and ask, what is my goal? What are my responsibilities towards other people? Before I say this, before I write something, what are my responsibilities to everyone else, to other people, to the whole society? That's what it means by politics, okay? What are my responsibilities to my neighbor? So for example, let's say we're in a discussion like this, and there's a group and we're having a discussion and someone's being annoying. There's one person being annoying. When I consider how to respond to that person, I have to think, first of all, how would God want me to respond? Then I have to think, what about all these other students here? How would they want me to respond? So for example, if Gianna was down there fooling around and distracting the class, and I'm thinking, well, what should I do? Should I start a 25-minute lecture to Gianna about her behavior? That would not be the right response because there's other people here. You see, so I've got to think about the right response has to take into consideration that there's a dozen people here meeting for a class, and I can't waste the whole class lecturing one student on their behavior. So I've got to think about the whole group and how my response, what I say, what I write, affects the whole group. And so there's a right way and a wrong way to deal with things when I'm in a group setting or when it has an effect on other people. So that makes it more complicated. So we've got to think about that. I've got to think about my own family. I've got to think about business, right? You can make a decision in business. For example, you can have an annoying customer, and one day you decide to write a big, long, nasty email to that annoying customer just to blow them up and try to destroy them like a nuclear bomb email. And you can get great satisfaction in doing that, in loving your weapon of mass destruction email that you compose. But that customer can turn around and take that email and post it on Facebook and say, look at what Mr. Michael wrote to me in this email. Look how nasty he is. Look at how terrible that company is. And that what you decided to do in that composition could turn around and negatively affect your whole life or your business or your family and so on. So you've got to think about those things when you respond. And then lastly, you've got to think about yourself. and how this or that response affects you, because you always have the option just to ignore a problem, right? One of the works of mercy is to bear wrongs patiently. Sometimes it's better just to ignore a problem. Sometimes you can't ignore a problem. Sometimes you have to ignore a problem. So for example, most of you are young, and when you're young, you do a lot of dopey things because you just don't know any better, and you're young. There's not many consequences. So for example, you see something sitting on the floor, let's say like a I don't know, something's on the floor, and you wonder what it tastes like. So you put it in your mouth, and it's just dumb, right? But you're a kid, and who cares? I'm a kid. I can do something dumb here. I'm not going to die. And parents can choose to blow up and go crazy about stuff like that. But the problem is you do stuff like that every day, all day, every day. And if the parents blew up, every time you did something dopey as a child, they would never get anything else done. And so there's a time when parents, have to get on you about things, but there's also a time where parents have to learn to ignore you because you're just a kid and you're going to do all kinds of dopey stuff. It's like having a puppy. When the puppy chews a hole, in your shoe, you don't blow up on the puppy. You just say, "Oh, I left my shoe on the floor. That was stupid. I shouldn't have done that." You don't put the puppy in prison because of that. And, parents have to learn to deal with children in a patient way because they've got other stuff to do, right? You've got business to do. You've got to take care of the house. You got laundry to do. You got chores to do, places to, all kinds of other stuff to do. So we also have to think about ourselves and realize that we always have the freedom to simply accept a wrong and not respond to it, just to bear with it patiently. So you can see that anytime you compose something, anytime you write or speak, you've got a lot of stuff to think about. You've got a lot of stuff to think about. You've got to think about God's will and what you're responsible to communicate for the sake of your relationship with God. You've got to think about society beyond just you and this one other person and what effect your composition might have on the community. You've got to think about business, what effect a decision in one place or a speech or something written in one situation might affect other people. You've got to think about your own family. So if you go out as a kid and do something bad, don't you realize that that makes your whole family look bad, right? That should be part of what you think about when you do things. When the 10 Commandments say honor your father and your mother, notice the 10 Commandments don't say obey your parents. Many times we imagine that the 10 Commandments teach us to obey our parents, but that's not what it says in the 10 Commandments. It says much more than that. It actually says honor your father and your mother. It doesn't just say obey them. It says to bring them honor, to seek to honor them and bring them honor. So, before you write something, before you say something, before you do something, you should ask yourself, is this going to bring any dishonor or embarrassment to my family? You can see this in things like the forums. I'll peek on the forum, and the student forums I created for the kid, for you guys to enjoy just personal discussions with each other. But I'll see, one of my kids will get on there and I'll see them post something dopey and I'll be like, oh man, that's so embarrassing, right? I wish that kid would think about his brothers and sisters and his parents before he wrote that, that his favorite thing to do is like play with Barbie dolls, right? I wish he would have thought twice before he wrote that. And so, you need to think about the effect and your responsibility to other people when you write. So that's why St. James tells us to be slow to speak, be careful to speak, be careful before we write, to think about all the consequences that might come and to use all of that before we respond so that we can respond in the best way possible. So we have to think about the goals in writing. And as I said, all of these things are in your control. That's what's good about it. What's good about it is that your responsibility and the goals for your composition, your writing, your speaking, they're all in your control. And so you can prepare to say something, do your very best to say it, and walk away knowing that, I did the best that I could do. I worked as hard as I could. I researched as hard as I could. I prayed about it. I studied to try to figure out what I should say. I thought about all of these different people that could be affected by what I said or what I wrote. And I said these things. I did my best, and I can walk away with a good conscience, knowing that I did the best that I could do. That's what's great about writing and speaking, is that the goal is actually in your power, and you're not subject to what some nasty person decides to do in the end, right? You're not subject to what the crowd decides to do. And if you think about history, many of the greatest speakers and writers were hated by the people they lived with. Jesus was crucified. He wasn't, he didn't become a millionaire and become a celebrity influencer in Israel. They crucified him. Socrates was put to death, right? He wasn't celebrated. People didn't like visit his house and, pay to tour his living room and stuff. They wanted to kill him. So sometimes, the things that we say and the things that we do, they won't bring us the results we want. And that's none of our business, because that's not in our control. Our responsibility is to say and write and do what's right, because that's the goal of what we say, write, and do, just to do what's right, to have a good conscience. What other people do with it is their own business. If you go online to buy something, you go on Amazon.com, right? Let's say, Xavier was telling me about, he's got a book that he wrote on Amazon.com, right, Xavier? So let's say I go and look at this book that he posted on Amazon.com. What's funny about Amazon is you'll have somebody give it a 5-star review, and somebody else will give it a 1-star review. One person will say, this is the awesomest book ever written. Another person will say, this is the worst book ever written. And that's just how life goes, right? You can't control the responses of people to different things, and you don't know why they respond the way they do. It might turn out that the guy who gave the 1-star rating was actually Xavier's brother, being a punk, and he went on there and gave it a bad review just to get on him. And it's, customers are looking at that, and you don't even know who wrote those reviews, right? But we can't worry about that kind of stuff. If you start a business, you can't worry about, as crazy as this sounds, you can't worry about what the customers think necessarily, because, every single person on earth doesn't need to be your customer. You don't need 50 billion customers. If you have just enough customers to serve your goals for your business, you can set up your business to be something that pleases you, that you love to do, that you find to be very satisfying, and you can be content with that, right? So it all comes down to understanding your goal and making sure your goals are wise and reasonable, not foolish. So again, that list of things to think about religion, to think about politics, to think about business, to think about your family, and then to think about your own happiness. All of those things need to be in your head whenever you speak or write. And you've got to learn to not make goals for yourself that are not in your control, because you're just going to be miserable if you live like that. You're going to be miserable, okay? It's very miserable. Just think about it. Imagine if you decided to paint a picture, and you spent weeks and weeks and weeks painting this picture, and you didn't judge the picture for whether the picture was what you wanted it to look like and what you wanted to produce. You judged your picture entirely based on how your Uncle Frank responds to it, right? And Uncle Frank's a nasty old guy who just always criticizes everything. And as you're working on this painting, you're saying, oh, I hope Uncle Frank likes it. I hope Uncle Frank likes it. And Uncle Frank comes over, and what does he do? He says, hey, why'd you make that line crooked, right? And you've drawn this whole picture, all of this work, all of these things, and Uncle Frank sees one crooked line, as if that's the only thing that you did. And you set all of your hopes on pleasing Uncle Frank, and Uncle Frank came over, and all he did was find fault with it. Whose fault is that when you walk away unhappy? Whose fault is it? That's your fault, right? And we have to learn not to do that. So we've got to be careful when we get into composition. We've got to be careful that we understand the goal of writing and speaking, and that whenever we write something, we aim at a goal that's within our control, and That'll prevent us from being frustrated in anything we write or produce in any area of life, not just in writing. So let's look at this lesson here. This first lesson in this composition book, which is really helpful because it addresses some of these problems. Hopefully you can all see this. When most kids hear about writing class, I know when I went to school, if you talked to me about writing class, I wanted to find a hole in the ground to go and hide myself. Writing was the worst because we weren't taught how to write. We weren't taught what the goals of writing were. We weren't, none of these things were taught to us. And then we were given writing assignments. We had to write about things we didn't know anything about, and we had to write about things we didn't care about. And then we submitted this paper, and we just waited to find out what the teacher thought about our paper. And if the teacher gave us an A, we said, oh, I'm a good writer. Look, my teacher gave me an A. And if the teacher gave us a bad grade, we said, oh, I'm not good at writing. The teacher gave me a D. But we had no idea why one paper would get an A or one paper would get a D. We were just slaves to the judgment of the teacher. And when we went out of that class beyond school, none of us learned how to write, and none of us had any idea what the goals of writing were. And what's great about this textbook that we use in this composition class is it gets right to the point and says that way of learning to write is totally wrong. And we've got to learn to approach writing with a right understanding, because all of us love to communicate. We all love to communicate. Most of the time, your parents probably have to tell you to be quiet because you communicate too much, right? When I was a teacher in school, I had to spend a lot of my time telling the kids to stop talking to each other. Even here in a video meeting, I'll have to say, stop chatting with each other, stop chat. And why? Because we like to communicate. So if you think about people complaining about writing, they say, oh, I don't like writing. School has to be very bad at what it does if it makes kids not like to write, because we actually love to write. We love to write. We love to talk. We love to do these things. We love to communicate. And so if the classes are making us not like writing, then the classes are actually the problem. You're probably writing notes to your friends, you're writing text messages or emails to your friends, you like to post on forums, and then it's time for class and you're dreading or writing it. Well, that's a problem with a class. Okay, so this textbook starts to talk about how we all take pleasure in expressing our ideas. We all love to write, we love to speak, we love to draw, we love to sing, we love to do all these things. The problem is, if we don't have right goals, then we start to not like to do those things, and that's our own fault. So for example, if you like to draw, but you're worried about what Uncle Frank thinks, well, then you're going to end up not drawing because you're worried about Uncle Frank rather than just enjoying drawing. Let's say you love to dance, but you're worried about your older brother makes fun of you well, that's his problem, really. And if you worry about what, big brother Tommy says, who just complains about everything and is just jealous because he can't dance as well as you can, and that's why he criticized. Well, if you worry about what brother Tommy says, well, then you're going to be unhappy and you're not going to like to dance because you worry about being judged. We have to get out of that. We have to be more courageous than that. We have to be tougher than that. We have to be free from that kind of slavish thinking, and we've got to enjoy that freedom and do things for the right goals and not worry about the wrong goals. So we take pleasure in ideas. We love to write. We love to speak. We love to produce things and do things. And so when we find that we don't like it, something's wrong. And what's usually wrong is our goals are wrong. So if you're writing just for your English class, you have the wrong goals and you're going to be unhappy doing that. And so when we learn to write, if it's going to be a good writing class, we have to actually have a class that allows us to serve the real goals of writing. And that's what this book does, which is why I chose to use it in the Academy. It gives us the right goals. And most of you, maybe not all of you, but that's not important, but most of you, the feedback that I receive is that students like this composition class. And I think this is why, because it actually serves the right goals. So we all take pleasure in expressing ideas. We should like writing. We should want to learn to write well. So that's the first lesson. Then in the second lesson, we talk about where do the sources of our ideas come from. And this is very interesting because when we look at writers and artists and things, we always hear people talking about how they want to be unique. They want to be individual. They want to be original and so on. People always talk about that. And then what they usually mean by original, what they usually mean or what they usually end up doing is just acting weird, right? So we sort of imagine that to be original, you have to dye your hair purple, or you've got to get, tattoos on your face, or you got to wear some kind of crazy clothes or something. Say, oh, look, now I'm original, right? Now I'm original. Look at me. I got blue hair. I'm original. And the problem, like our book explains, is you don't need to do anything to be original, because your life, who you are, what you experience, what you do every day, all of your circumstances, they're already original. They're already original. Like your fingerprint, right? You know that your fingerprint, you can be identified by your fingerprint because no one else has the same fingerprint. You are already original. If you would just be yourself and not try to be something for some other people, if you would just be yourself, you would already be original. The stuff that you write, the stuff that you say would be helpful because it's original. That's actually what makes you valuable to discussions. For example, some of you live in other states. So let's say you're homeschool students in Connecticut, in New York, in New Hampshire, in Florida, in Spain, in California, in Louisiana. I have no idea what your daily life is like in these different places. It's probably very different from my daily life. Your education as a 14-year-old is probably very different than my education was as a 14-year-old. I find that very interesting. I'm interested to know about your personal daily experience because it's unique, it's original, and that's what makes it interesting. Okay, so what this textbook helps us to understand is that you don't need to try to be weird to be original or to be valuable or unique or influential. You need to realize that you are already unique and influential and original just by being yourself, because there's no one else in the world who shares all of the circumstances and experiences that you do. And they're your most valuable resource in communicating. Your most valuable resource is your own unique life and experiences. Everything about you is unique. I don't have your parents. The other students don't have your parents. We don't live in your house. We don't live in your town or your state or your country. We all have different experiences, all different situations. Some kids have parents who are very wealthy and they live a certain way. Other parents have kids who live on a farm and they live a different way. Other kids live in a city, but they don't have much money. They live in a different way. And all of those different circumstances make those individual people interesting and unique. And it gives us all something to contribute to discussions and to decisions that need to be made and planning and so on. And we have to learn that we don't need to have this fake modern idea of what it means to be original, which just means you act like a weirdo. We can just be ourselves and understand that we are already original. So that's a great lesson that this book teaches us. There are 3 sources of ideas we learn about. So when you think about what should I write, what should I say, where should I get ideas from? What's the number 1 place we should get ideas from? Go ahead and tell me. I know most of you know this. What's the number 1 source of ideas for writing and speaking or making music, writing songs, whatever? The number 1 source is our experience, right? Our experience. That's the number 1 source of interesting content for anything that we're going to write about or share. People are interested in just knowing about your experience. You probably don't think that because you probably have wrong ideas like, oh, well, Tommy's parents are wealthy and my parents are simple. So I'm going to try to act like a wealthy. That's just, you make yourself useless by doing that because you're usually wrong about what you think other people think. And if you just be yourself, you'd be valuable and useful. So the first and most important source of ideas for writing, speaking, writing music, writing poetry, drawing pictures, anything. The most important source for us as individuals is our own unique experience, which makes everything we say or write or do unique by itself. Okay, so that's source number one. What's another source of ideas that we learn about? Imagination, very good. So imagination is a second source. And what's interesting about imagination, most people don't understand what imagination is. They think you can just think of anything. They say things like, oh, with your imagination, you can do anything, think anything you want. And that's not true. That's not true, because our imagination is actually limited. Our imagination is limited by what? What limits our imagination? Anybody have a good guess? Good idea? Very good. Our experience actually limits our imagination. So imagination is really just a way that we take our experience and we sort of change some of the details, right? That's imagination. And we could do it for the sake of writing a story. We could do it for the sake of writing a poem or a song or drawing a picture or something like that. We could imagine if our house was not in our town, but in a different town or in a different period of time. You might think about things like that. Like, what would happen if I, grabbed my laptop and my smartphone and I traveled back in time and lived in the 1500s with all the stuff that I have now? That's imagination, but it's limited by our experience. So imagination allows us to have a greater source of ideas, but it's still tied to our imagination. And here's an important philosophy point. It's impossible to imagine anything that you have never experienced. It's impossible. In fact, one of St. Thomas Aquinas's arguments to prove that God exists is that we talk about God and think about God, we imagine God, and therefore God must exist, because it's impossible to imagine anything that doesn't exist. So that's an interesting little point about imagination. So our imagination is the second source. What's the third source? Who knows the third source of ideas? Very good. Language, right? So language, and all that means is communicating with other people, right? So the first source of ideas is our experience, which is always unique, which is why it's so valuable to us. And we're also in control of our own experiences, right? You can choose to do things for the sake of gaining experience. That's another interesting thing to think about. If you'd like to make yourself unique in some way, one way is to have an experience that's unique. Some people do that to an extreme because they're crazy, but there are simpler ways to do that. Like, I'd like to grow some vegetables in my backyard for the experience of growing vegetables, or I'd like to travel to India because I'd like to have the experience of walking and talking and living in India. We can gain experiences by choosing to do things that add to that experience, and that adds to the sources of our ideas. Imagination allows us to go beyond that. And, there's good imagination and bad imagination. Every time you tell a lie, you're using your imagination, right? In a bad way. So lying is an example of the bad use of imagination, but we can also use imagination for good purposes, like to entertain or to teach a lesson, like Aesop does in the fables, okay? Aesop uses his experience with animals to create stories about animals using his imagination, but they're still linked to his experience with those animals. And then the third way is by language, and all we do in language is this: we share in someone else's experience and imagination. That's all language does. If I talk to one of you about your experience, I'm simply learning about your experience and adding the knowledge of your experience to my own experience. So again, it's just coming back to experience. Or if you write an imaginative story and I read your story, I'm adding your imagination and the ideas of your imagination to my imagination, but it's still rooted in your experience. So all of this comes back down to experience. That's ultimately what determines whether what we write is interesting or not. And you can just imagine Why do some writers become famous? Why do some people become famous? Because their experiences are often extraordinary, right? If somebody climbs Mount Everest and they're the only person in the world who knows what it's like to stand on top of Mount Everest, that experience is rare. And that's why lots of people are interested in it. So we want to know, what was it like? What did it feel like? What did it sound like? You know, what were you thinking? What could you see? We have all these questions about a unique experience. So sometimes extraordinary experiences can make somebody famous, right? Like look in Turkey, there were just these earthquakes and all of these buildings collapsed and all of these people died. It was this terrible tragedy. And they were rescuing people like a week after it that had been trapped under the rubble of the buildings for a whole week. And none of us have any idea what that would be like. So we're all interested in hearing from them. I think it was in the sixes. I think it was, the magnitude was in the sixes. But it destroyed all these buildings and killed thousands and thousands and thousands of people. But people were rescued like a week later, and none of us could imagine what that's like. And so we're very interested to learn about their experience. And there's all kinds of interesting stories about, you know, how they survived or what they were thinking or what they were doing while they were trapped under these buildings. You can see how it was just like 2 weeks ago. You can see how these experiences, right, because their experience is extraordinary, that makes it interesting in an extraordinary way, right? But we all have unique experiences. You know, some of us may be not as exciting as being trapped under a building, but like personally, I don't want to be trapped under a building to write an interesting book. I would rather not be able to write that book. So it's not necessarily good for us to desire those experiences, but we have our own experiences, and in God's providence, you know, he sort of directs and determines what our experiences will be. And therefore, we need to look at our experiences and realize that these are things that God intended for us to know and have that other people don't know and don't have. And so our experience becomes a source of responsibility. We've got to share what our experience reveals to us and make it available to other people. That's what we do by composition. Okay, so what I want you to see is it all comes back down ultimately to experience. Experience is really in control of God's providence. So we've got this unique experience that's like our fingerprint in anything we say or write. If we lie, we actually destroy our experience. Lying makes us useless. And, you know, ultimately, it might get us attention for a little while, but ultimately lying makes us irrelevant. The problem that most kids have, especially teenagers, and if you're a teenager, you'll know that I'm right about this. Teenagers often feel pressure to try to be like everybody else. They're actually afraid to be unique. They're afraid to be different. They want to be like everybody else. And they judge themselves successful whether they become more like everyone else. So they're looking around saying, well, what's everybody wearing? What kind of clothes are popular? What kind of shoes is everybody wearing? You know, what books is everybody else reading? What movies is everybody watching? What songs, what music is everybody talking about? Because that's what I'm going to talk about. And they actually make themselves unimportant. They make themselves ordinary and common, and they actually lose all of their significance as individuals by worrying about what other people are doing. And the world, in a good sense, is actually asking teenagers to do the opposite. The world is asking teenagers to be themselves and to share their own unique gifts and knowledge and experiences and skills. The world is asking teenagers to grow up, be themselves, and share their own individual, unique experiences. But the teenagers are often doing the opposite. They're embarrassed of their uniqueness. They're embarrassed of and they're trying to cover it up. So that's part of the problem with being a teenager. If you think about college admission, and I'm going to finish with this. This is the last thing I'm going to talk about. If you think about college admission, a college asks you to apply, and they ask you to present yourself to the college for admission. They ask you to be yourself. They are not asking you to be like anybody else. And in fact, they're intentionally seeking to find different kinds of people to bring together in the college community, because that's what makes college life most interesting and helpful for all of the students in the college. They're intentionally trying to find different kinds of people and bring them together. And what the teenagers are trying to do, which is the opposite of what they should do, the teenagers are thinking about their application, and they're writing things trying to prove, and this is especially true for homeschool students, which is even worse. They're trying to prove that they're like everybody else. And when they do that, they actually cause themselves to become unattractive to the college that's not asking them to be like everyone else, but is actually interested in their own unique experience, whatever that may be. So this book, this course on composition, one of the things that it's going to focus on is just bigger philosophical problems that we have, which if we would learn to get over these things and not allow these things to influence us the way they do, we would actually be able to write well, to speak well, to be happy every day, to not worry about other people's judgment of what we say or what we do, but to know that, we need to do what pleases God. We need to do what's good for our neighbor. We need to do what's good for our own business responsibilities. We need to do what's good for our families. We need to do what's good for ourselves. And if we pursue these things with those goals in mind, we'll find that our experience is our best source of ideas for all these things. And if we're just content to be ourselves, not ashamed of who we are or what our circumstances are, and enter into the world comfortably with the right goals, we can live very happily and be very good at writing and speaking and so on, by just getting these things right. So that's a lot of talk from me. Most of you already know these things to some degree, but I just want to continue to hammer this point, that the whole point of this book and these lessons on composition is that you already have the most important source of information and ideas to write about, to talk about, to paint, to draw, to write music about, whatever you want to do. You already have the most important ideas right in your own experience. And you have to learn to respect that. You have to learn to realize that God himself has arranged that experience for your good. And you need to learn to look to it, to learn from it and use it to be happy in life. So the goal of this class today was to talk about the goals of writing. I hope I made that clear. And now, like I said before, I've done my job. That's what I wanted to communicate, and I'm satisfied that I communicated it well. Now I leave it to you to decide what to do with it, right? So you're going to go, and now you can choose to, take these things into consideration and actually begin to think about them and work on them and practice them and use them. Or you can just say, nah, I like being dopey. I want to look like that guy, or I want to dye my hair green so I can be you. I can't control that, but hopefully you see the truth of this message that's in our course textbook, that your experience is ultimately the source of your greatest ideas. And we also need to understand that God controls that. So God sort of gives us that experience and directs what we can write and speak about. So I hope that's helpful. Think about this and use it as you write and speak. Learn to set realistic goals that are in your control, and you'll find that all that anxiety goes away, and you can just focus on your writing and your speaking. So I hope that's helpful. That's all that I wanted to talk about today. So if you have no questions, you're free to go. Get these composition lessons done and turned in so you can move through this course. Just so you know, if you're younger and you're in the English composition course, this English composition course is part of our high school program. So you're already getting high school work done. So it's worth your time. So that's why this course is especially important. But like I said, this is a really good textbook that I hope you study carefully and make it one of the main subjects you work on, because it'll be very helpful for you. So that's all for today. If you've got any questions, we can hang around and chat a bit, but otherwise you're free to go. Have a good day. God bless you all.